Hi, today we're going to do a simple web browser, and I'm going to show you how to use a UI web view in conjunction with a UI text field to specify and display web content. We'll also be using a UI alert view to display the current URL that the browser is looking at, and then 3 button controls, forward and back, as we would normally have in a web browser, and a button to display the alert view that shows the current URL of the browser. So UI web view is a direct descendant of UI view, but UI web view also responds to a delegate on UI scroll view, and the reason it does that is so that we can scroll content in the web view, and we can use a pinch gesture to move in and out if we specify some things in an interface builder to allow us to do that. It gives us a web browser control, a very fully featured web browser control. We have not only methods to load a URL, go forward and back, and so on and so forth, but we can also evaluate JavaScript so that any site that contains JavaScript can be properly displayed without any further work on our part. Loading a URL is conceptually very simple. We simply use the load request method and pass it an NSURL request object. Now, that object is not a string, it's an NSURL request. So when we have a text field that we're wanting to get the string value out of to pass it in, we need to convert that string value using this sort of syntax right here. We're going to pass the string value into a method of NSURL called URL with string, and that gets us a URL, and then we're going to make a request out of that URL using this request with URL method of NSURL request, and then we're going to pass that request to load request, and that will load up our string as a URL. The previous and next page methods are trivial. They are go back and go forward on our UI web view instance that we have. So now, some things about UI alert view. UI alert view displays an alert, a sort of a message box. And unlike a lot of our methods, unlike a lot of our classes, in a UI alert view doesn't have any class method to display an alert. We have to actually alloc and init that. So when we do that, we're usually making an alert view within a method of something else. We want to make sure that alert view is auto-released when the compiler and the application is done with it. So we want to specify this auto-releasing mode. But the initializer is init with title, message, delegate, cancel button title, and other button titles. I'm going to go backwards here. Other button titles is a list of strings terminated with a nil. If we only have one button, we just pass nil to other button titles, actually nil, comma nil. Cancel button title is the button title of the main button that actually cancels the alert view. And normally we specify @OK for this or @cancel for the cancel button title. The delegate is usually self, in other words, the controller that is displaying the alert view. And then the title is the title of the message box that we're going to get out of this alert, and then the message is the message itself. So in this demonstration, what I'm going to do is pass I'm going to be passing this in our NSURL request description, which is a string, to the message. And that will show us the entire NSURL request. This is probably not the best way to do it, but for the purposes of simplicity and within the time constraints, this is what we're going to do today. Okay. So in Xcode, I've already set up some subviews on a view. This is a single view application. So in my storyboard, I've got a UI web view control. I've got a back and forward button. I've got this button that's going to answer what is the current URL of the web view, and I've got an NS text field or a UI text field that we're going to type in, and that will supply the URL initially for our web view. So let's make a couple of changes here. First of all, this text field, I want to set the keyboard to URL. I want to set the return key instead of return. I just want it to say go. Okay, and then that sets up properties on the keyboard. Likewise, in the UI web view, I want to enable multiple touch so that we can have the pinch gesture. And I also want to use scales page to fit, because if I do this, then I'll be able to zoom in and zoom out. Scales page to fit fits the page's width to the width of the web view. This is very important, and this is idiomatic of how users expect a web view to behave. In other words, the page's full width will be displayed. If we can't see everything in that web view because it's too small, then we can pinch out or pinch in, and this is what allows the pinching behavior. So this is very important. Now let's look at the view controller's header file. Notice I don't have any of these properties or actions hooked up, but I have an IB outlet to the UI text field, which we actually don't need, and I'll delete that. The only IB outlet we need here is the browser. So let's go ahead and hook that up. So control dragging from the view controller to the UI web view. I'm designating that as the property browser. And I also have some actions designated. URL selected, address lookup, back, and forward. URL selected is actually going to happen, so control and dragging from the text field back here, and that's actually going to happen when the text field is completed. Now, we want to make sure that we get the right method. Editing did end is not the correct method. The correct method here is did end on exit. So we actually will drag from did end on exit back to the view controller, and URL selected is our proper method. All right. And then again, methods. This is going to be our back button, so that method is back. This is our forward button. That method is forward. And this is our query of the URL button. So this is going to be address lookup. And you'll notice that I've already specified these actions. So now they're all hooked up. Now if we look at our implementation file, we didn't need to synthesize URL text because I took it out just now, if you recall. I'm synthesizing the browser. And then in view did unload, it's very important that any property that we have as a subview, a retained subview of the main view, and in this case that's just browser, is we set that property to nil. And the reason is that view did unload is only called on a catastrophic unload of your application. In other words, iOS, the operating system, determines that your application is marked for unload or something happened. Anyway, view did unload is only called in event of an unload of your application that was unplanned for. So it's important to release these. And the way we do that is we simply set the property to nil. Now, I have the 4 actions, and I have not specified methods at all for these actions. I just have them in here so that we could drag controller actions to them. So now let's fill these out. The first 2 we're going to do are the 2 simplest ones. We have a browser object. The back button is just going to tell our browser object to go back. Likewise, the forward button is going to tell our object our browser object to go forward. Okay, so now we have these two and they're working just fine. Now, URL selected, we remember, is going to be called did end on exit on that text field. So the text field is sender. So now the first thing we need to do is resign the first responder on the sender. This makes the keyboard go away. So we're done editing. We resign the first responder. That makes the keyboard go away. The first responder of the text field is the keyboard. When we resign it, it disappears. So then the next thing we need to do is load the request into the browser. So we start this with self.browser, and then we're going to use that method that we talked about, load request. And then that is an NSURL request, a request with URL, and then that URL is an NSURL, and that's a URL with string. And now we can use simply sender.text. Then we make sure our square brackets match up, and we're all set. So we can see conceptually this is very simple. We take the sender's text, make it into a URL. We take that URL and make it into a URL request, and we take that URL request and pass it to load request on the browser, and then the browser loads up the requested URL. Extremely simple, actually, in concept. When we want to retrieve the address that's currently in the URL, we need to set up an NSString for that object, and I'm going to call that address. And that's going to be an NSString representation of the URL request. So we're going to use a class method on NSString, string with string, and then the string is going to be the browser's request, in other words, where it currently is as a URL request, and then we'll get the description of that. Now, the description of an object, as we already know, is the string representation of that object. So now, the second part of that is to open up our alert view with this address as the message. So we're going to set up a UI alert view. And remember that we're not going to be able to use a class method. This is an instance method. It's going to return an object, and that object is going to be retained. So we need to release it in our address lookup method. So we need to specify that this is auto-releasing. And we'll call this alert address. And that is equal to a UI alert view, which is allocated, and then initialized with this init with title, message, delegate, cancel button, and so forth. So now I'm going to set this up so it's nicely and all in line and so on and so forth. Now the title is the title of the alert view. So I'm going to call that title current URL, colon. The message is just going to be this string object that we got. In other words, the description of the browser's request. Address. The delegate we always talked about, self. Cancel button title, I'm just going to say OK. And then other button titles, nil. We don't have any other buttons. If we did have buttons here, we would need to write handlers for them as well. And now it's telling us that we haven't used the alert address. Well, alert address is an alert view, so now all we need to do is show the alert view. And there's a method, show, and that does that. Okay. And so now we have our actions specified. They should all be hooked up on the storyboard. And when we run our application, we'll see if it all works. So the UI web view's address will be loaded from the text field when it resigns. We'll be able to see the address from any given point, and then we'll be able to go backward and forward within the application. So let's go ahead and go to Google. We press go. We see that we get to Google, and that's fine. We notice that we can scroll just fine. The width is set, and we can see that we are at http://www.google.com, and this is our alert, UI alert. Okay. Now let's go searching. We'll try iOS. Now we can go back. Brings us back to google.com. We can go forward. Okay, so all that works. And we'll look at this link, and it will load up. And we notice that this is scaled to the width of the browser. We can't see this, but a multi-touch gesture would allow us to zoom in. And now we can read this. We can zoom out a little bit. If we go back to that page. We go back to Google. We can also go forward and forward again, and the zooming metrics are retained. So this is how we implement a very, very simple web browser. In reality, if we had a web browser, we would use another thread of execution to load this content so that the user's experience is not interrupted while we're loading the content, and we would do some more checking, error checking in our web browser. But this gets you started using a web browser control, a UI web browser control, and that's it. Thank you very much.